Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your essential sources, the articles, the history, the core research, and really try to distill them into clear, actionable knowledge.
And today, we are diving deep into a life that is just um, intellectually massive, the life of William Edward Burghardt Du Bois.
It's hard to even know where to start. To call him just an important figure feels like a huge understatement.
It really is. I mean, you could argue he was the chief intellectual architect of the modern civil rights movement in America, but even that feels too small because his influence went so far beyond the U.S.
And the timeline of his life is just staggering. He was born in 1868, right after the Civil War.
And he lives until 1963. So his 95 years literally span from the aftermath of slavery to the absolute peak of the civil rights movement. It's the entire story.
Absolutely. A pioneer in so many fields. He was the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard.
The 1895, yeah.
A foundational sociologist, a brilliant historian, a journalist, and of course, a founder of the NAACP.
But I think what we really want to explore today is the journey itself. You know, how does a quiet, data-driven academic become this radical global activist who starts challenging the very foundations of Western capitalism?
Right. That's our mission here, to trace that intellectual transformation and unpack the key ideas he developed. Because these concepts, they're not just historical footnotes.
Not at all. They are literally the vocabulary we still use today to talk about race and identity and justice.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's set out the three core concepts right at the top because we're going to be coming back to them again and again.
Good idea. First up, you have the color line.
The color line.
It's a phrase he popularized. He actually borrowed it from Frederick Douglass, but he made it his own. And for him, it wasn't just about, segregation signs.
Yeah.
It was this enduring global injustice, a fundamental political, even metaphysical boundary separating black and white humanity across the entire planet.
And then the second one, which just completely revolutionized how we think about identity, double consciousness.
Ah, yes. I mean, you read his definition today, and
Yeah.
it still just hits you. It's so clear.
It really is.
He describes this internal psychic split, right? This feeling of being both inside and outside of American culture at the same time. His words were, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings.
That sense of two-ness. It's
Yeah.
this constant, exhausting negotiation between who you are and how the world forces you to see yourself through this lens of racism.
Exactly. And the third one, which is, let's say, often revisited and sometimes pretty controversial, is the talented 10th.
Right.
This was his deep belief that the top 10% of African Americans, the intellectual elite, needed the best possible education. A classical liberal arts education.
And the goal wasn't just for their own success.
No, not at all. The goal was for them to act as the leadership class. They had a duty to lift up the entire race and secure full rights for everyone. And we'll see how that idea didn't just appear from nowhere. It grew out of his earliest work as a sociologist.
Perfect. So we have the color line, double consciousness, and the talented 10th. And just a quick note for you before we jump in, since we'll be saying his name a lot.
Oh, yes, pronunciation.
He was apparently very specific about it. It's Du Bois, with the emphasis on that last syllable.
It sort of fits, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A certain fastidiousness for a man whose whole life was about intellectual precision.
It really does. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Part 1, the foundations of the scholar. Where does this story start?
So Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And, when you think of the great black leaders of that era, you often picture them coming out of the post-slavery South. His New England origin feels important, almost unlikely.
It was definitely atypical. Great Barrington was, for its time, a pretty integrated community. It was nothing like the post-Civil War North in most places.
And his family had deep roots there, very deep. His mother's family, the Burghardts, had been free black residents for generations. They traced their ancestry back through Dutch, African, and English lines. So this relative insulation from the absolute worst forms of racism was pretty unique for his childhood.
He still experienced racism, of course. His father left when he was 2, so he and his mother were in difficult circumstances.
Right. But the town's structure gave him one huge advantage.
Education.
Education. His mother, his teachers, they all saw how brilliant he was from a young age, and they really championed him. This created in him this deep, lifelong belief that knowledge, that intellectual rigor, was the ultimate weapon against prejudice.
And you see that belief immediately in his educational path. But it takes a really sharp turn when he moves south in 1885.
He does. His mother passed away just before he turned 17, but his church congregation actually raised the money to send him to Fisk University in Nashville.
An HBCU, a historically black college and university.
Yes. And this was his first profound, unfiltered exposure to the brutal reality of the South.
He went from a place where the color line was maybe more abstract, more permeable,
To a place where it was rigid, enforced by law, by Jim Crow, and by a constant threat of violence.
What a shock that must have been.
A total shock. He would teach in rural Tennessee during his summer breaks, and seeing the poverty, the lack of education, the systemic suppression of his people, he said it transformed him. It gave him an activist purpose he didn't really have before.
He was seeing the color line in practice for the first time.
Viscerally. But after Fisk, he goes back north for the most elite education you could get.
Harvard.
He transfers to Harvard in 1888. And it's telling, Harvard didn't accept any of his credits from Fisk. He had to basically start over.
Wow.
But he was driven. He got a second bachelor's degree, cum laude, in 1890, and then went straight into graduate studies. This all culminates in 1895 when he becomes the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard.
And his dissertation was already pointing the way, wasn't it? It was on the suppression of the African slave trade.
Yes, always using historical data to fight racist myths. But the step that really, truly globalized his thinking was his fellowship in Germany. In 1892, he went to study at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin.
That seems like a critical moment for his intellectual maturing.
It was where he said he intellectually came of age. He's studying under these giants of social science like Max Weber. He's traveling all over Europe, and for the first time in his life, he feels a kind of freedom he could never find in the U.S.
He famously wrote that in Europe, he felt simply like a man.
Exactly. Imagine that. In America, he was always a problem, always categorized by race. In Europe, he was judged on his intellect. It gave him this external vantage point, a way to look in on the American racial system as an observer.
It let him see race not just as an American problem, but as a global system built into Western civilization itself.
Precisely. And the validation he got was huge. You mentioned Max Weber, one of the founders of modern sociology.
Hey.
Weber was deeply impressed. Years later, when other academics would bring up racist ideas about black inferiority, Weber would specifically point to Du Bois as the counterexample.
To have one of the pillars of European thought use your existence as a weapon against racism, I mean, that's powerful.
It's immense. So he comes back with this Harvard PhD, this European training, and he immediately starts pioneering a field we now just take for granted, empirical sociology.
Which brings us to his work in Philadelphia.
In 1896, he gets a research assignment from the University of Pennsylvania. His job is to study Philadelphia's 7th Ward, an African-American community that was struggling with poverty and crime and was just buried under negative stereotypes.
And this research becomes his first major book, The Philadelphia Negro, in 1899.
A monumental work, just foundational. This was the first intensive scientific case study of a black community in the U.S. He didn't just sit in an office. He used rigorous methods, census data, surveys, social mapping.
What did that social mapping actually look like? It sounds really ahead of its time.
It was incredible. He literally mapped the community block by block, noting businesses, churches, schools. He categorized households by their economic status. He conducted 5,000 personal interviews.
5,000.
And he used all this data to systematically prove that the community's problems weren't because of some inherent racial inferiority. They were caused by social factors: poverty, lack of opportunity, and systemic white prejudice.
He was using science to dismantle racism, and it's so important to note, this predates the famous Chicago School of Sociology by decades. He was setting the standard.
He absolutely was. And it's in this study that he first uses the phrase, the submerged 10th, to describe the struggling black underclass.
Ah, so that's the origin.
It is. He argued their condition was a direct result of slavery and discrimination. And this idea of a submerged 10th was the seed that would later grow into his much more famous and more controversial concept of the talented 10th.
So it wasn't just an elitist idea. It was a direct response to the deep poverty he documented with his own eyes in Philadelphia.
That's the key. It was a strategy for pulling that submerged 10th up.
Okay, so the scientific foundation is there. But in part 2, we start to see the Du Bois that we really recognize today: the activist, the critic, the revolutionary. And the move to Atlanta University in 1897 seems to be the catalyst.
It was. He went there as a professor of history and economics, and even with very few resources, his output was just extraordinary. He was publishing constantly, and he organized the annual Atlanta Conference of Negro Problems. He was quickly becoming the preeminent black scholar in America.
Which, of course, put him on a collision course with the other giant of the era, Booker T. Washington.
Yes, this conflict basically defined black politics for the next 25 years. It was this parting of the ways, a deep philosophical split.
So let's break that down. What was Washington's position, the Atlanta Compromise?
Washington's argument was essentially one of accommodation. He told white leaders in the South that black Americans would, for the time being, accept discrimination. They would accept segregation and disenfranchisement.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for white support for basic, practical education, industrial and agricultural skills. The idea was to build economic stability first in rural areas and postpone the fight for political rights. It was about pragmatic survival.
And Du Bois, the Harvard and Berlin-trained scholar, saw this as a terrible bargain.
Utterly unacceptable. He demanded three things, and they were non-negotiable: full civil rights, full political representation, and higher liberal arts education for that leadership elite, the talented 10th.
Because without educated leaders, the whole race would just remain subservient.
That was his argument. You can't just build an economic foundation if you don't have the political and legal right to own the land it's built on. It was a fundamental disagreement over goals, over strategy, over timelines.
But this philosophical debate was about to get intensely personal for Du Bois. It was a moment of shocking violence that ended his career as a detached academic. The lynching of Sam Hose in 1899.
This is the pivotal emotional moment in his entire life. Sam Hose was a black farm worker accused of murder near Atlanta. He was tortured, mutilated, and then burned alive in front of a mob of thousands of people.
And Du Bois was planning to write about it, wasn't he?
He was. He intended to write a calm, factual defense of Hose for a local newspaper, based on the evidence he had.
But something happened on his way to the newspaper office.
As he was walking through downtown Atlanta, he saw something in a storefront window. It was Sam Hose's knuckles, which had been cut off by someone in the mob, being openly displayed for sale.
My God.
And that single image, it had shattered his belief in detached science. He realized that intellectual truth, that data, that calm reason, it was completely powerless against that kind of visceral, public, celebrated brutality.
The color line wasn't an academic concept anymore. It was marked by a piece of a man's body in a shop window.
He wrote later that the sight convinced him he could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. His mission changed in that instant. It went from documenting truth to mobilizing people to act on that truth.
Which leads directly to his great manifesto, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903. What kind of impact did that book have?
It was an earthquake. James Weldon Johnson said it had an impact on educated African Americans similar to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the intellectual declaration of war for the new century.
It's where he famously declares, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line."
Yes, framing it as a global issue.
Yeah.
And it's where he fully articulates double consciousness, giving a name, a language, to that internal struggle that millions of people were feeling but couldn't necessarily define.
Right. It helped them understand it wasn't a personal failing, it was a social condition imposed on them.
Absolutely. And even the structure of the book itself was a radical statement.
The epigraphs for each chapter.
Exactly. Each chapter starts with two epigraphs, one from a famous white poet and one from a black spiritual. By placing the music of enslaved people on the same level as the high European tradition, he was making a powerful claim for intellectual and cultural parity.
So from the book to political action, this public break with Washington's philosophy leads to the Niagara movement.
Yes, in 1905, Du Bois, along with other activists like William Monroe Trotter, met near Niagara Falls on the Canadian side because they couldn't get hotels on the American side.
Of course.
And they wrote a declaration that explicitly rejected the Atlanta Compromise. They were demanding full equality immediately, no more waiting.
But they had trouble getting their message out.
A huge problem. Most of the established black newspapers were controlled by allies of Booker T. Washington. So Du Bois had to create his own platforms. He started two journals, the Horizon being the most important, to publish his uncompromising arguments against submission.
And events just kept proving his point. The Brownsville Affair, the Atlanta race riots in 1906.
Exactly. Those disasters showed that economic progress meant nothing without political rights and legal protection. It solidified his position. The time for quiet compromise was over. The era of organized, uncompromising demand had begun.
That groundwork leads directly to his most lasting organizational achievement. So let's get into part 3, how the Niagara Movement's philosophy grew into the most powerful civil rights organization in American history.
The Niagara movement itself was a bit too small, a bit underfunded to really last. But its core ideas were picked up by a larger group of black and white activists, which led to the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1910.
And Du Bois was there from the start. It's noted that he's the one who suggested using the word colored. Why was that specific word important to him?
He was very deliberate. He wanted the organization's name to explicitly include dark-skinned people everywhere. It was a signal right from the beginning that for Du Bois, the American fight against the color line was inseparable from the global fight against colonialism.
He became the director of publicity and research, but his real power, his real voice, was the organization's monthly magazine, The Crisis.
The Crisis was his weapon. It was his megaphone. The first issue came out in late 1910, and its goal was to show the danger of race prejudice. And it was a massive success. By 1920, it had a circulation of 100,000.
That's an incredible reach for the time.
It made it maybe the single most influential African-American publication in the world, and Du Bois used it to wage war on everything.
What were some of the key campaigns he was fighting in its pages?
Oh, everything. Scathing editorials against Jim Crow laws, against corruption in black institutions. He even published historical essays that challenged white-centric history, but the #1 campaign was against lynching.
Right, he was pushing for a federal anti-lynching law.
He was, and he often used this brutal, savage satire to make his point. He was trying to expose the moral hypocrisy of it all.
And he wasn't afraid to use graphic evidence, which was just not done in mainstream journalism back then.
No. The 1916 Waco horror article is the prime example. It was about the torture and murder of a teenager named Jesse Washington. Du Bois didn't just write about it. He sent an undercover investigator to Waco, Texas, and he published the photographs of the lynching.
That must have been unbelievably shocking for his readers.
It was a radical act of journalistic courage. He forced people, white and black, to look at the sheer barbarism they were allowing to happen.
And his advocacy wasn't limited to race. He was an early supporter of women's rights, wasn't he?
He was a longtime supporter of women's suffrage. Now, he was critical of the movement because many of its white leaders refused to also fight against racial injustice.
Of course.
But his own publications consistently featured feminist essays. He saw the fight for women's rights and the fight for racial justice as two sides of the same coin. The fight for democracy.
And he even took on taboo subjects like interracial marriage. That 1913 editorial against anti-miscegenation laws is just stunning.
It's so powerful because of how he frames it. He doesn't just call the laws racist. He frames it as an issue of women's rights and legal protection for black women.
How so?
He argued that because a white man could not be legally compelled to marry a black woman, these laws essentially reduced black women to the position of dogs. It stripped them of any legal recourse if they were coerced or seduced.
That's a brilliant legal and social argument.
He was basically saying the fight isn't about wanting to marry white people. The fight is about demanding legal equality and protecting the dignity of black women. It was a radical demand for autonomy.
So while he's fighting these battles at home through the crisis, he's also building his role as a global thinker, as the architect of Pan-Africanism.
That global vision started very early. In 1900, he was at the first Pan-African conference in London. That's where he delivered his speech to the nations of the world, which contains that famous color line statement. He was pleading with European powers to grant self-government to their colonies.
And he used his sociology skills on the world stage that same year, at the Paris Exposition.
Yes, he organized the exhibit of American Negroes. And this wasn't just art. This was Du Bois using data as a weapon against propaganda. He put together hundreds of photographs, charts, and graphs showing the economic and educational progress of the African-American community.
He was literally showing off the achievements of Black America to an international audience using science to counter racist stereotypes.
Exactly. It was a data-driven argument for full humanity, and it won a gold medal. This all led to his 1915 book, The Negro, which was a history of Black Africans that predicted the eventual global unity of people of color.
Then World War I brings this really difficult moment, his 1918 Close Ranks editorial.
Very controversial. He argued that African Americans should set aside their grievances with Jim Crow for a moment and join the war effort to prove their loyalty to America.
A stance he came to regret.
He did, especially after what happened when the soldiers came home. The Red Summer of 1919 was a period of horrific white mob violence and race riots across the country. Over 300 African Americans were killed.
And he had already organized the Silent Parade in New York in 1917 to protest similar violence.
Right. Almost 9,000 African Americans marching down Fifth Avenue in total silence.
Right.
A massive, dignified protest. So after the war, his tone hardened completely.
The Returning Soldiers editorial?
It's militant. He basically tells black veterans to bring their fighting skills home and wage a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. No more accommodation.
And during the same period, he's got a major ideological rival in Marcus Garvey.
A huge rivalry. Garvey was a black nationalist. He promoted racial separatism, economic independence, the Back to Africa movement. It was a completely different philosophy from Du Bois' integrationist, talented 10th approach.
Was there any common ground?
Briefly, Du Bois initially supported Garvey's shipping company, the Black Star Line. But the philosophical gap integration versus separatism was just too wide, and they were competing for the same pool of money and public support.
It got pretty nasty between them.
It did. Du Bois called Garvey the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race. He supported the idea of Africa for the Africans, but he didn't think that meant it should be ruled by African Americans who had no real connection to the continent. He saw Garvey's movement as reckless and distracting from the fight for rights in America.
So as we move into the 1930s, Du Bois' thinking shifts again. This is part 4, a period of really intense political radicalization and revisionist history.
Right, and it starts with another huge break, this time within the NAACP. By 1934, he's clashing badly with the new president, Walter White. And the core of the fight is Du Bois' shocking reversal on segregation.
This must have just stunned everyone. He started arguing in favor of separate but equal, the very thing the NAACP was created to destroy.
He did. His logic was pragmatic, if controversial.
Yeah.
He argued that the fight for integration just wasn't working, that it seemed politically impossible for the time being.
So what was his alternative?
He said African Americans should tactically accept separate schools and services, but use that separation as an opportunity to build their own independent, high-quality, black-controlled institutions, to build economic and cultural power from within.
So he wasn't endorsing the racist idea behind it. He was proposing a tactical retreat to build strength.
That's how he saw it. But the NAACP leadership saw it as a total betrayal. They said it legitimized segregation and undermined all of their legal work. They demanded he take it back, he refused, and he resigned from the NAACP for the second time.
So he goes back to academia, back to Atlanta University, and throws himself into what might be his most important scholarly work, Black Reconstruction in America.
This book, published in 1935, is his historical magnum opus. It was a direct assault on the dominant historical view of the time, which was called the Dunning School.
And what was the Dunning School's argument about Reconstruction?
Their argument, which was deeply racist, was that the period after the Civil War failed because of Negro ignorance and corruption. It was the narrative used to justify Jim Crow, to justify taking away the right to vote.
And Du Bois just demolishes that narrative with data.
Completely flips it. His thesis was that black people were the central revolutionary force in the Civil War and its aftermath. He showed that the brief period of black political leadership actually achieved incredible democratic goals, like creating the first public school systems in the South.
He argued it wasn't a failure caused by black people, but a success that was violently overthrown by white reactionaries who were terrified of black political power.
Precisely. The book was so radical that mainstream white historians just ignored it for decades. But today, Black Reconstruction is seen as the foundational text of modern African-American historiography.
And at the same time, the Great Depression is pushing his political thinking even further to the left.
He starts to see capitalism itself as the engine of racism. He's reading Marx and finding his analysis of economic exploitation incredibly useful for explaining the subjugation of colored people all over the world.
This global view leads to some very controversial travels in 1936 to Germany and Japan.
His trip to Nazi Germany is complex. He noted that as a black man, he was treated with respect, but he was also absolutely horrified by the Nazi treatment of Jewish people. He called it an attack on civilization.
But his view of Japan is much harder to square for a modern audience.
It is. Du Bois saw the world through an anti-imperialist lens, and he saw Japan as the only non-white nation that could challenge the colonial power of Europe and America. So he visits Japanese-controlled Manchuria.
It's a shocking statement, but it shows his perspective. He hoped that colonialism by a colored nation would be less oppressive than colonialism by white Europe. He was desperate for a non-white global power to emerge.
That's a challenging idea, especially given what we know about Japanese brutality later. It is. And he was disturbed when Japan allied with Nazi Germany. But he blamed the West for it, arguing that their relentless hostility and racism had pushed Japan into that corner. For Du Bois, the hypocrisy of the West was always the root cause of these global conflicts.
He comes back, publishes his second autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, in 1940, and by the end of World War II, his focus is totally international. He's back at the NAACP and at the founding of the United Nations in 1945.
And their goal at the UN was huge. They wanted an end to the entire colonial system and a guarantee of racial equality in the UN Charter.
But they were ignored.
Completely ignored by the colonial powers. But Du Bois didn't give up. He attended the final Pan-African Congress, where he met a young activist named Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. And this all leads to a landmark petition in 1947.
An appeal to the world.
Yes. It was a formal petition, drafted by Du Bois and submitted to the UN, detailing the human rights abuses against black citizens in the United States. It was a brilliant strategic move. It weaponized the Cold War, exposing American hypocrisy on a global stage and forcing the U.S. government to confront its own failures.
So now we come to the final chapter of his life, Part 5, a period really defined by Cold War persecution and his final complete political radicalization.
The late 1940s, the McCarthy era, it was a dangerous time. Anti-communist paranoia was everywhere. And the NAACP, to protect its funding and its reputation, started distancing itself from anyone with leftist sympathies. That included Du Bois.
But Du Bois wouldn't back down. He kept his associations with people like Paul Robeson. He kept his critique of capitalism.
Right, and he saw the Cold War as a fight between systems. And in his view, the Soviet Union, for all its faults, had at least officially rejected racial and class distinctions. He called it the most hopeful country on earth from that perspective. This led to his final bitter resignation from the NAACP in 1948.
And this is when the U.S. government starts to target him directly, with what's been called ruthless repression.
The FBI had a file on him since the 40s, but it got serious in 1950. He became the chairman of the Peace Information Center, which was promoting the Stockholm Appeal to ban nuclear weapons.
A peace petition.
A peace petition. And for this, in 1951, the Justice Department indicted Du Bois and other leaders for failing to register as agents of a foreign state.
They were accusing him of being a Soviet agent.
Essentially, yes. It was a political show trial. And many of his old allies abandoned him. Even the NAACP refused to support him publicly.
He was in his 80s, facing prison time. It must have been terrifying.
Immense pressure. But the trial produced one of the most incredible stories of that whole era. During the trial, his lawyer mentioned to the judge that Albert Einstein had offered to fly in and serve as a character witness for Dr. Du Bois.
Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist on the planet.
The prosecution's case just sort of evaporated. The judge dismissed the charges. But even though he won, the government got its revenge. They confiscated his passport and held it for 8 years.
And the professional cost of that was devastating.
It meant he couldn't attend the 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia. This was the meeting of 29 newly independent nations from Africa and Asia. It was the absolute culmination of his entire life's work on Pan-Africanism.
And he was forced to watch it from his home in Brooklyn.
Excluded from his own legacy. It's just heartbreaking.
Once he finally got his passport back in 1960, he started traveling again.
Extensively. To the Soviet Union, to China. In 1961, he gave a famous speech in Beijing, urging a political alliance between African Americans and China, saying, "China is colored and knows to what a colored skin in this modern world subjects its owner."
Which sets the stage for his final, definitive political act, at age 93.
In October 1961, in protest of a new repressive law targeting communists, Du Bois officially joined the Communist Party.
He joined the very organization that the government had used to persecute him.
An ultimate act of defiance. He wrote that he believed in communism as a planned way of life, designed for building a state whose object is the highest welfare of its people. For him, it was the final rejection of the capitalist system he saw as the root of the color line.
And his last chapter closes that circle, taking his Pan-African vision back to Africa.
His old acquaintance, Kwame Nkrumah, was now the president of a newly independent Ghana, and he invited Du Bois to move there and oversee a massive project, the Encyclopedia Africana.
So he and his wife Shirley moved in 1961.
They did. And in 1963, when the U.S. government refused to renew his passport again, he made his final symbolic break and became a citizen of Ghana. He died in Accra on August 27, 1963.
Just the timing. His death was one day before the March on Washington.
One day. And Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, stood at the Lincoln Memorial and asked that massive crowd to observe a moment of silence for him, the man who had laid the philosophical groundwork for that very moment. The final irony is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which finally enacted so many of the rights he fought for his entire life, was passed almost exactly a year after he died.
So to try and summarize a life that big, it's like his career had three distinct but connected phases.
I think that's right. First, you have the foundational sociologist of the 19th century, the Philadelphia Negro, using hard data to dismantle racist science.
Then second, he's the radical activist and journalist of the early 20th century, the NAACP, the crisis, giving us the language of double consciousness and the strategy of the talented 10th.
And third, he becomes the radical global historian and Pan-Africanist, Black Reconstruction rewriting American history and connecting the struggle at home to the global fight against colonialism and capitalism.
It's just amazing that one person contained all of that. Academic, writer, organizer, global citizen. And yet he was also this man of very specific personal dignity.
Oh, absolutely. Insisting on being called Dr. Du Bois, a title he had earned against impossible odds. He was famously disciplined and meticulous, and of course that insistence on the correct pronunciation, Du Bois.
And his entire legacy is about that, about insisting on intellectual excellence as a weapon against oppression. The honors he received, the library named after him at UMass Amherst, they all point to a life lived in constant, brilliant defiance of the color line.
His real contribution was giving us the words, the framework for understanding it all, for understanding modern race relations, not just in America, but as part of a global system rooted in colonialism.
Which brings us back to his core idea, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. If you look at the world today, at the global disparities in wealth and power that still map so closely to those old colonial and racial lines he identified 100 years ago, you have to ask, how much of our modern global economic system is still quietly running on the same colonial software he worked so hard to dismantle? It's a question that suggests Du Bois' vision of justice is still, in many ways, waiting for us in the future.